Hey everybody, welcome back to Tent to Outdoors. My name is Alan, one of the last 3 contestants on this season 10 of Alone. This video, I'm going to do a recap on season 10, episode 10, on August 10th with Tent to Outdoors. It was kind of a dad joke, but you have to admit it's a little bit funny. There were no taps this episode. There are 3 people left for the finale next Thursday night on August 17th. So first up on this episode, we have Mikey. They show Mikey emerging from his shelter to some fresh snow. And they immediately went to his snowman that he constructed for his son, and it looked pretty good. So with the fresh snowfall, Mikey decides it'd be a good opportunity to head out, look for fresh sign and tracks in the snow, and hopefully get lucky and pick up the track of either a small game or a large game animal. With some tracking, unfortunately, Mike did not find any fresh sign except for a single mouse. Mike talked about how he was at a bit of a disadvantage compared to the other Canadians on the show. He was referring to myself and Wyatt because he had never experienced a Canadian winter. Mike reveals to the audience that he's feeling a little low due to his son's upcoming birthday and the fact that he's hungry and hasn't had a grouse or anything substantial for quite some time. Mikey does not give up on his quest for food, and he ends up setting up some traps to catch some additional mice. So it's day 47. Mike is able to harvest a couple mice throughout the night, and he skins them and prepares them for eating, and he decides to stuff a couple of those mice with reindeer moss to take home as a souvenir and possibly to give one to his son. So Mike boils up a big pot of reindeer moss after he boiled it twice, and he makes reference to it tasting like mini wheats, and he felt like he just had a hot meal after eating that, and that's exactly what he needed. Mike makes reference to how the hunger is starting to get to him. And as he's making that reference, you can see on the far side of the screen that a marten is on the beach. He spots it, grabs his bow, and goes after it. Unfortunately, that marten gave him the slip and escaped before Mike was able to get a shot. Mike said it's time to push, and he is going to give 110%. So Mikey heads back to his shelter, and he discovers that something had paid him a visit. He assumes it was a marten, and that marten stole his 2 stuffed mice, the other mouse that he had saved to consume later on that day, and a gut can that he was saving for bait. Mikey was super frustrated at this marten, and understandably so. So Mikey's next scene was singing happy birthday to the camera for his son Nikolai's 5th birthday. It was a pretty emotional scene, and I truly felt for Mike at that moment. And he also showed the audience all the toys that he had made for his son during his time out there. We have to admit, Mike is a super talented woodworker, and some of those things he made, super impressive. Next up on this episode, we have Wyatt. So Wyatt wakes up in a super good mood, says good morning to the audience, and he heads out to check his gill net, and he's very pleased to find a 3 or 4 pound whitefish trapped in his gill net. He plucks it out and begins the cleaning process. So Wyatt talks about how many people he thinks are left, and he's pretty sure there's not very many. Credit to Wyatt, he was correct. There were only 3 left. And he makes reference to, man, I hope they're not having as much fun as I am. And he was honest with the audience. He says, I hope they're dropping like flies. Wyatt says, I have a lot left, and I'm not going anywhere. The next scene shows Wyatt making a comment about how this experience so far has been reasonably easy for him. And he gives credit to all the difficult things he's been through in his life to make this experience in the wild not that bad. And I loved his next comment. He said, my time out here, the wind has blown away a lot of the dirt that's been stuck to me. He then discusses how he dreams of being able to one day bring his wife and kids out to his very same location and spend a few days so they can experience some of the joy he felt when he was out in his location. It's day 49. Wyatt has a massive breakfast, he's feeling good, and he heads out to check his gill net. Upon checking his gill net, he finds another massive pike stuck in his gill net. I think it might have even been bigger than the other one because the girth on it and the big belly on it, man, it was massive. As he's holding up that pike and laying it on a log to process, he says, man, this puts me close to day 100. As he was sitting enjoying his catch, he makes reference to his father, and he talks about the advice that his father gave him shortly before he left. He got a little bit emotional and said, man, Dad, we are doing it. So the next scene was pretty funny. Wyatt wakes up and he gives a whole monologue to the audience in, I think it was a Russian accent. It's cold, it's snowing, and I love it. And yeah, it was pretty funny. It just shows his positive attitude and that his mind is in a good place in this competition. Then they show him processing wood. He needs to cut 50 pieces of wood, and he gets through it. He closes out day 50 with a big meal of fish and heads off to bed. Later on that night, he wakes up to a chimney fire. Luckily, he's able to put it out quite quickly and prevents it from spreading to the rest of his shelter. Wyatt had forgotten to water down the moss around his chimney before he went into his shelter for the night. So after spending a really cold and windy night in his shelter, Wyatt heads outside to a pretty dreary looking, cold, windy, snowy day, and he makes some modifications to his chimney to prevent that from happening again. So I was up next on the episode, and my first scene was me doing a skinny check. Now you got to remember that there's no way of looking at yourself when you're out there. There's no mirrors. So the only way to look at yourself is to film yourself, stop it, go back on the camera and watch it through the little viewing screen. So I really wanted to see what my body looked like. I mean, I knew I'd lost weight. I made reference to that morning I'd scratched my back and I could feel bones. I could tell I was losing weight. So I filmed myself, I watched it back, and I was happy to see that I still had some fat on me. I still had a little bit of tummy fat. I had some fat around my pectorals, and I still had a little bit of love handles going on. So I knew that I wasn't in a desperate situation yet, and I knew that I was in no danger of being pulled. So with the calmish weather, I was excited to have the opportunity to fish, because there were days out there where it was stormy and windy and rough, and sometimes 2 or 3 days where you couldn't fish. So I always wanted to take advantage of fishing whenever the lake was calm and there was no wind. So before long, I was able to hook into a nice lake trout and get him to the shore without any issues. And it was a good sized lake trout. I think it was about 24 inches, probably 4 pounds, maybe 5 pounds. That's an estimation. And as I was cleaning it, I noticed that it had white cysts all over its guts. Now there was nothing wrong with the meat, and the fish looked healthy. Like, it had good mass, it didn't look thin, and it fought hard. So I knew that it wasn't sick at the time, but it definitely had something going on with its innards. It had these, like 100, these tiny little white dots. They didn't look like eggs to me, and so I ripped the guts out and I cooked it and ate it. I made sure I boiled it a little bit longer just to ensure that if there was something wrong with that fish, if it did have a parasitic invasion or if it was hosting some sort of critter, that I would kill it in the boil. So I made sure I boiled the living hell out of that fish before I ate it. As I'm cleaning the fish, actually I'd finished cleaning the fish, I was cutting off its tail for the smoker, because sometimes I didn't have enough room in the smoker, and I just usually cut off the tail and tossed it away. Going back in time, I probably would have attached one of the fins onto my lure to make it look more like a fish. So as I was cutting off the tail of the fish, my knife slipped. It was a moment of carelessness, and I just nicked my finger. It was a small cut, but the force that was behind that knife, if it had hit my hand or my finger more directly, it could have been a pretty bad cut. Similar to Wyatt, I was thinking how many people were left in the game at that time, because I really had no idea. And I was making guesses who was left in the game. So my next scene shows me lying in my sleeping bag one morning in my shelter, and that had been the coldest night so far. And I was kind of disappointed in my sleeping bag's ability to keep me warm, because I was sure that a -40 sleeping bag would keep me warm during my whole experience out there. But I don't know if it was because I was diminished and my body had a hard time keeping warm, but I remember being quite cold that night and having to seal up the top of my sleeping bag and just leave a tiny little air hole to help keep myself warm. And yeah, that sleeping bag was, I was a little disappointed in it, to be honest. So after that cold night, I came up with a strategy. It was a wake-up call, and I did not want that to happen again. So my plan was to, before I went to bed, light a fire in my teepee, heat up some rocks, place one on my chest and place one in my groin, so that would not happen again. I did some more fishing unsuccessfully. They just weren't biting that time of day, but you never know when they're going to bite. So whenever I had a chance, I always fished. Yes, the fishing was often better in the evening, but there were times where I did catch fish throughout all times of the day. So I never gave up hope of catching fish, even in the afternoons. My next scene is day 50, and I was pretty proud and happy to have made it to day 50. That was kind of a goal I had in my mind, and I was happy it was day 50. It had gone by fairly quickly, but man, day 50 was like things changed. I woke up to a snow-covered winter landscape, and it was extremely cold. So one of the first things I did, I headed down to my fishing rock to see if I was able to fish from that rock. Now it was reasonably steep, and it had a fairly sharp drop off, and I was always nervous that it would get covered in snow and ice and I wouldn't be able to fish off that rock, because it was definitely one of the deepest parts on my location. Luckily the snow had melted and it gave me a nice little platform to fish. So I fished from that dry, non-slippery section of my rock for a time. My hands were really cold. It was difficult to fish. But I got a few good casts in. They weren't biting. I wasn't having any luck. And because my hands were so cold, the spool flew out of my hand and went in the water again. But luckily, I grabbed the other end of the line, and I knew that my spool was attached to my fishing line. So, I was worried, but I wasn't too worried. So I quickly grabbed another empty spool I had up top, and I just wound the spool onto my other spool and retrieved the spool from the water. So it ended up not being a big deal. The next scene was a voiceover, and I just basically talked about all the things I'd learned from watching previous contestants on old seasons of Alone. And after I knew I was on the show, from July 1st when I got the call all the way up to launch date, I was doing a lot of additional research. Things were just going through my mind, and if I didn't know the answer to something, or if something might have come up, I wanted to know how to do it. So I was doing a lot of research and finding a lot of answers before launch day. They then showed me sitting in my teepee on the edge of my bed, and I started talking about the dark days of the game. And just from watching the previous seasons, about this time when the weather turns cold, the fishing slows down, or the lake freezes, the berries are gone, you're spending a lot more time in your shelter. And the previous recaps I've done, I've always referred to those times as the dark days of Alone, and I knew they were upon me. And just thinking about that before I came on the show, I tried to mentally prepare myself for that. I mean, you can only prepare so much until you actually are in there during your experience. It definitely got harder. The days are shorter, there's less to do, and you're spending more time in your teepee with your thoughts. And I tried really hard not to let my mind go to those dark places. It happened, but I tried to really control those dark thoughts and those tough times in the shelter when you're spending so much time in there. During that scene, I convinced myself that I needed an extra helping of fish that day. So instead of one fillet, I had 1.5 fillets, and it was delicious. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. My name's Alan, this is Tenta Outdoors. Don't forget to tune in next Thursday night to the finale of Season 10 Alone. We'll see you next time.